He can't remember the last time he felt truly warm or dry. A fine cold mist seems to rise not just from the sea, but from the very steel of the ship itself, a permanent dampness that seeps through his wool overcoat, through his uniform, and settles deep in his bones. For 12 days the world has been nothing but this: the metallic shudder of the deck beneath his feet, the constant low groan of the engines, and the endless slate-grey churn of the North Atlantic. He is one of 5,000 men packed into a vessel designed for a fraction of that number. The air below decks is thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, diesel fuel, boiled cabbage, and a nervous energy so dense you can almost taste it on your tongue. He is 20 years old, a farm boy from Iowa who had never seen an ocean until he boarded this ship in New York Harbor. Now, the ocean is all he sees. He feels impossibly small, a single anonymous face in a sea of identical helmets, a tiny living gear in a machine whose scale he cannot begin to comprehend. He is just one man, but he is not alone. By the spring of 1944, he will be one of over 1.5 million American soldiers standing on British soil. 1.5 million. It's a number so vast it loses meaning. So let's put it another way. In 1943, the city of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, had a population of just under 2 million people. What America was attempting to do was to take a city the size of Philadelphia, its men, its vehicles, its food, its fuel, its weapons, its mail, its medicine, everything, and move it 3,000 miles across an ocean at war. This was not a migration. It was a military operation of biblical proportions, the single greatest logistical feat in the history of human conflict. It was the essential, non-negotiable prerequisite for the invasion of Europe, for the liberation of a continent, for the event that would come to be known as D-Day. And it had to be done in the face of an enemy that owned the deep, the German U-boat, the wolf packs. For every soldier like our boy from Iowa staring out at the grey waves, the most immediate enemy wasn't waiting on a beach in Normandy. It was lurking somewhere beneath him, silent and unseen, a torpedo waiting in a tube. To understand how this happened, how this city of soldiers was picked up and set down on the doorstep of Fortress Europe, we have to go back. Back to a Sunday morning in December 1941. America is a nation at peace, but it is an uneasy peace. The world is on fire. The armies of Nazi Germany have stormed across Europe, from the shores of France to the gates of Moscow. The Empire of Japan is carving a brutal path through China and Southeast Asia. For 2 years, America has watched from the sidelines, a conflicted giant bound by a deep-seated desire to stay out of the old world's wars. It is a nation of immigrants who had fled those conflicts, a people who remembered the bitter cost of the Great War and had vowed never again. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt walks a tightrope, sending aid to a desperate Great Britain under his Lend-Lease program, calling America the arsenal of democracy, while promising American mothers he would not send their boys to fight in any foreign wars. Then comes the 7th of December, Pearl Harbor, a devastating, stunning attack that shatters the illusion of safety. In a few short hours, the debate is over. Isolationism dies in the smoke and flames of the Arizona. A shocked and enraged America is catapulted into a global war it is tragically unprepared to fight. The American military in 1941 is a shadow of what it would become. It is the 17th largest army in the world, smaller than Portugal's, with soldiers training with wooden mock-ups of machine guns and trucks with the word tank painted on the side. The sleeping giant, as a Japanese admiral famously noted, has been awakened. But a giant rising from a deep slumber is still groggy, disoriented and vulnerable. The first desperate months of 1942 are a cascade of disasters. In the Pacific, the Philippines fall. American and Filipino troops are forced on the Bataan Death March. One island bastion after another is swallowed by the Japanese war machine, but in the halls of power in Washington and London, a momentous decision is made, a strategy that will define the course of the war: Germany first. Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill agree that for all the wounds inflicted by Japan, the greater, more existential threat to the world is Adolf Hitler. Nazi Germany, with its industrial might, its scientific prowess, and its monstrous ideology, is the primary enemy. it must be defeated first. The Pacific would become a holding action. The main effort, the overwhelming weight of Allied power, would be brought to bear against the heart of the Axis in Europe. But how? The continent is a fortress. From the northern tip of Norway to the Spanish border, the coast of Europe is a wall of German concrete, machine guns and artillery. The Soviet Union is bearing the brunt of the Nazi war machine on the Eastern Front, absorbing horrendous casualties and begging, pleading for the Allies to open a second front to relieve the pressure. The only logical place to launch such an assault is from the British Isles. England, battered and bombed but stubbornly undefeated, would become the unsinkable aircraft carrier, the forward operating base, the training ground, the warehouse, and the final launching point for the liberation of France. And so began the plan. It was codenamed Operation Bolero. Not a battle, but a build-up. A slow, steady, relentless flow of men and material from the factories and training camps of America, across the treacherous North Atlantic and into the ports and airfields of Great Britain. It was a problem of pure, mind-numbing mathematics. An invasion force would need hundreds of thousands of fighting men, but every fighting man needs at least two others behind him in support roles: cooks, mechanics, clerks, doctors, engineers, drivers. And every one of those men needs a place to sleep, food to eat, a weapon to carry, ammunition for that weapon, a uniform to wear, boots for his feet. The scale is staggering. To move one single armored division required 74 ships. That's just one division. By 1944, there would be dozens. This wasn't just about moving an army. It was about moving a modern, mechanized nation's ability to wage total war. Every Jeep that rolled off an assembly line in Toledo, every Sherman tank from Detroit, every bullet from a factory in St. Louis had to be crated, loaded onto a rail car, transported to an East Coast port, hoisted by a crane into the hold of a Liberty ship, and then survive a 2-week voyage through submarine-infested waters to a port in Liverpool or Glasgow. It was a supply chain 3,000 miles long, and every single link was a potential point of failure. A single torpedo didn't just kill the men on board a troop ship. It could send 10 urgently needed tanks, 1,000 tons of ammunition, or a field hospital's entire supply of blood plasma to the bottom of the sea. The Battle of the Atlantic, therefore, wasn't just a naval campaign. It was the battle for the lifeline of D-Day. If Bolero failed, if the U-boats succeeded in choking off the flow of men and steel, there would be no invasion. The city-sized army would never arrive, and Fortress Europe would remain inviolate. The entire Allied strategy rested on the ability to solve this one colossal logistical puzzle. It was the beginning of a quiet, unglamorous, and absolutely vital war fought not by generals over maps, but by quartermasters with clipboards, by welders in shipyards, by merchant mariners on rusty freighters, and by the young men in uniform sailing into the unknown. The abstract problem of logistics quickly becomes one of brutal physical engineering. It began with a single object, the crate. Everything from a box of K rations to a P-47 Thunderbolt fighter plane had to be measured, weighed, and encased in wood. Quartermaster depots became vast forests of pine, their air thick with the scent of sawdust and the shriek of power saws. An entire science of packaging was born out of necessity. A Jeep, for instance, could be shipped fully assembled, taking up 1,114 cubic feet of precious cargo space, but disassembled and carefully crated, it took up only 365. The trade-off was time, the time it would take a motor pool GI in England to reassemble it. Every cubic foot in the hold of a ship was a battlefield, fought over by planners balancing the need for ready-to-use equipment against the demand for sheer volume. The primary vessel for this transoceanic conveyor belt was an engineering marvel of a different sort. It was not elegant, it was not fast, and it was certainly not beloved. It was the EC2SC1 cargo ship, known to the world as the Liberty ship. Based on a simple British design, it was a vessel stripped of all pleasantries, engineered for one purpose: rapid construction. Traditional shipbuilding, a craft of riveting that took months, was replaced by the brute force of welding. Prefabricated sections, some weighing over 50 tons, were built in factories across the country, hauled to the shipyards, and welded together like a gigantic iron puzzle. A skilled crew could lay a keel on Monday and launch a finished ship by Friday. More than 2,700 of these ugly ducklings would slide into the water, a fleet of identical 5-hatch cargo carriers, each capable of hauling 10,000 tons of war. That was the equivalent of 300 boxcars of freight, or 440 light tanks, or 2,840 jeeps. One single Liberty ship could carry enough sea rations, nearly 8 million tins of meat and vegetable hash, to feed an entire infantry division for more than a month. When these floating warehouses arrived in Great Britain, they met their next engineering challenge: the ports themselves. The docks of Liverpool, Glasgow and Bristol were ancient, cramped, and already straining under Britain's own war effort, their skylines a spiderweb of inadequate cranes. To unload the American arsenal, the Americans brought their own solution. They shipped over their own cranes, massive, modern, high-speed gantry cranes, disassembled and crated like everything else. They deployed their own specialized port battalions, units of the Transportation Corps trained in the high-speed art of stevedoring. They laid new railway lines directly onto the quays, so a crate hoisted from hold number 3 could be lowered directly onto a flat car destined for a depot in Wiltshire. The logistics were timed to the minute. A ship's manifest, radioed ahead, was broken down into a precise unloading plan before it even docked. Every box, every barrel, every vehicle had a designated spot on a specific train, heading to a specific depot, logged on a specific clipboard. It was the orchestration of chaos into a symphony of movement. The single most critical commodity was fuel. Modern mechanized war runs on it. The numbers are difficult to comprehend. For the invasion and the subsequent campaign, planners estimated they would need more than 200 million gallons of gasoline in the first 6 weeks alone. This river of petroleum, oil, and lubricants, or POL in military parlance, crossed the Atlantic in convoys of tankers, a prime target for U-boats. But getting it to England was only half the problem. Storing it was another. Colossal underground tank farms were excavated across southern England, camouflaged from the prying eyes of Luftwaffe reconnaissance planes. From these reservoirs, a web of pipelines, hidden in ditches and disguised as rural water mains, snaked across the landscape to airfields and vehicle depots. Yet the greatest engineering feat related to fuel was designed to solve the problem of supplying the armies after the landing. How do you get millions of gallons of gasoline onto a hostile shore under enemy fire? The answer was audacious. You run a pipeline under the English Channel. It was codenamed Pluto, for pipeline under the ocean. 2 types of pipes were developed. The first, known as Hayes, was essentially a hollowed-out armored underwater telegraph cable, 3 inches in diameter. The second, Hamel, was a more conventional but flexible steel pipe. Enormous, buoyant drums called conundrums, each 60 feet high and weighing 1,600 tons with the pipe spooled around them, were designed to be towed across the channel by tugboats, unreeling the pipeline like thread from a spool. It was a project of such breathtaking ambition that when it was proposed, the Chief of Combined Operations, Lord Mountbatten, simply wrote in his memo, "Let's test this at once." By D-Day plus 75, the pipelines were operational, pumping over 1 million gallons a day directly from Liverpool to the front lines in France, an umbilical cord of pure energy, tethering the Allied advance to the refineries of America. The soldier himself was a logistical equation. The Quartermaster Corps calculated that the average American GI in combat would burn through 4,500 calories per day. To provide this, they engineered a system of rations. The K-ration was its own small masterpiece of packaging and nutritional science. A waxed cardboard box, small enough to fit in a cargo pocket, contained a full day's food, broken into 3 meals. The breakfast unit held a tin of chopped ham and eggs, biscuits, a fruit bar, instant coffee and sugar. The dinner unit contained cheese, more biscuits, and a packet of lemonade powder. The supper unit provided a tin of meat, a chocolate bar, and bouillon. It was monotonous, often reviled, but it was calorically dense and it kept a man on his feet. To supply the 1.5 million American soldiers in Britain, the ships carried over 90,000 tons of flour, 20,000 tons of sugar, 11,000 tons of coffee, and millions of tins of the ubiquitous Spam. Then came the ammunition. The numbers become almost meaningless in their scale. A standard infantryman carried a basic load of 80 rounds for his M1 Garand rifle. A rifle company of 190 men would therefore need over 15,000 rounds just to start a fight. A single 105mm howitzer battery was allocated 1,200 shells as its initial supply. Planners had to calculate not just the amount, but the type. They measured supply in tons per weapon per day. They projected the expenditure rate for every conceivable combat scenario. By the eve of the invasion, more than 200,000 tons of ammunition were stored in vast, carefully dispersed depots across southern England, separated by earthen blast walls. A single stray spark, a single dropped shell, could have vaporized a square mile of the English countryside. The handling of this material was a nerve-shreddingly precise ballet of care and caution. Ultimately, all of this material had to be mobile, ready to storm a beach. This gave rise to one of the final crucial engineering efforts, waterproofing. Every one of the more than 200,000 vehicles destined for the beaches, from the quarter-ton Jeep to the 30-ton Sherman tank, had to be modified to survive its journey from the ramp of a landing craft through the churning surf and onto the sand. Teams of engineers from the Ordnance Corps worked around the clock in vast, open-air workshops. They sealed electrical systems with a thick, tar-like compound called Prestite. They fitted tall, snorkel-like pipes to air intakes and exhausts, turning trucks and tanks into semi-submersible beasts. They caulked every crack and seam in a vehicle's body. A Sherman tank required over 100 man-hours of this painstaking work. It was tedious, dirty, and utterly vital. An engine that flooded in 3 feet of water was as useless as one left behind in Ohio. This was the final link in the 3,000-mile chain. An engineering proof applied with grease guns and wrenches, ensuring that the machine, so carefully built, so painstakingly shipped, could complete the last, most dangerous 100 yards of its journey. But for the men inside those machines, the last 100 yards were an eternity of chaos and chance. The most meticulous plan, the most perfectly waterproofed engine, was still at the mercy of a shell crater hidden beneath the waves, or an unseen sandbar, or the simple, brutal physics of a 30-ton tank trying to find purchase on shifting sand. For every Sherman that clawed its way onto the beach, another faltered, its engine choked with salt water, its snorkel-like exhaust pipe belching a final plume of black smoke before disappearing beneath the surf. These machines, the pride of American industry, became instant iron coffins, taking their 5-man crews down into the cold, grey waters of the English Channel. The engineering proof, applied with such care in the workshops of England, met its rebuttal in the churning violence of Omaha Beach. For the infantryman, the cost was even more immediate. He was the most basic component of this invading army, and the most fragile. Weighed down with over 60 pounds of equipment, his rifle, his ammunition, his rations, his shovel, he was a pack animal destined for the front. When the ramps of the Higgins boats dropped, many men plunged not into waist-deep water, but into deep troughs gouged out by the tide. They simply vanished, pulled under by the very gear meant to keep them alive. Those who made it to the sand were often separated from their units, their equipment scattered, their radios, the vital nerve endings of command, ruined by salt water. A soldier from the 29th Infantry Division remembered losing his rifle in the surf and spending the first terrifying minutes of his war on his hands and knees, crawling under machine gun fire, not to attack the enemy, but to find the weapon of a dead man. The magnificent 3,000-mile supply chain had delivered him to this shore, but in the end, his survival depended on what he could salvage from the wreckage around him. And then there was the cold. The invasion plans had accounted for tides and moon phases, but not for the soul-sapping chill of the Normandy coast in early June. The men who survived the swim to shore were soaked to the bone, and they would stay that way for days, even weeks. There were no dry clothes, no warm barracks, only a hastily dug hole in the wet sand or the damp earth of a hedgerow field. The cold was a physical presence, an enemy as relentless as the Germans. It crept into their wool uniforms and leather boots and never left. It made fingers fumble with ammunition clips and turned sleep into a shivering, fitful misery. At night, men would huddle together for warmth, enemies of an hour ago now united against a foe that required no rifle to kill. Trench foot, a rotting affliction of the feet caused by prolonged exposure to cold and damp, began to appear within the first week, incapacitating soldiers as surely as a bullet. The logistics officers had planned for casualties of combat, but they had not fully grasped the toll that simple, unceasing misery would take on the fighting strength of the army. The fuel for this human machine was food, and that too was a calculated part of the grand logistical equation. The famed K-ration was a masterpiece of wartime science, a compact wax-coated box designed to provide a soldier with 3 meals, totaling around 2,800 calories. Inside were tins of processed cheese or chopped ham and eggs, biscuits, a fruit bar, instant coffee, sugar, and 4 cigarettes. It was enough, in theory, to keep a man moving and fighting, but the reality was grimly different. The meals were monotonous, greasy, and almost universally despised. Men ate them cold in their foxholes, the waxy cheese sticking to the roof of their mouths, the hard biscuits crumbling into dust. The coffee was a bitter powder that rarely dissolved completely in cold water from a canteen. But the true human cost was felt when this lifeline, however meager, was cut. In the tangled, confusing fighting in the Normandy hedgerows, units were frequently isolated for days at a time. A single K-ration meant for one day would have to be stretched to last 2, then 3. The gnawing ache of hunger became a constant companion, dulling the senses and shortening the temper. A private in the 90th Infantry Division recalled being surrounded for 4 days with nothing to eat but the few hard candies he had in his pocket. He remembered watching a cow wander into the field of fire and the desperate suicidal debate among the men about who would risk crawling out to try and milk it. When a relief column finally broke through, they brought not tanks or ammunition, but boxes of K-rations. He said he wept at the sight of them. The greatest army ever assembled was, in that moment, reduced to a handful of starving men, grateful for a cold tin of processed meat. The ultimate currency of the battlefield, however, was ammunition. The planners had stacked mountains of it in England, and the ships were waiting offshore to unload millions more rounds. But those ships and those stacks meant nothing to a rifle squad pinned down by a German machine gun, 100 yards deep in enemy territory. In the claustrophobic bocage country, firefights were intimate, vicious, and consumed ammunition at a terrifying rate. A company that entered a fight with its full complement of 15,000 rounds could find itself nearly dry in a single afternoon of sustained combat. For the individual rifleman, running low on ammunition was a unique and primal form of terror. Every soldier knew the satisfying heft of a full 8-round clip being shoved into his M1 Garand, and every soldier knew the hollow, metallic ping the rifle made when that clip was ejected, empty. In the heat of battle, that sound became a signal of profound vulnerability. A soldier of the 2nd Infantry Division described a firefight in a small French village where his platoon was running desperately low. They began counting their rounds. "I've got 2 clips," one man would yell. "I'm down to 1," another would shout over the din. They were forced to make every shot count, to wait until the enemy was impossibly close before pulling the trigger. When the supply sergeants finally managed to crawl forward with bandoliers of ammunition, it was, he said, like being given the gift of life itself. The logistical chain, stretched to its breaking point, had held. But for those men, for a few desperate hours, the entire war had shrunk to the 30 or 40 rounds of ammunition they held in their hands, and the sickening fear of the moment when there would be none left. The city-sized army, for all its might, was only ever as strong as its last bullet. This delicate balance between supply and demand, between an empty rifle and a full one, was the true hidden front of the war in Normandy. And by late July 1944, that front was on the verge of collapse. The Allied armies had finally achieved the breakout. After weeks of brutal, grinding warfare in the hedgerows, American tanks under General Patton were suddenly roaring across the French countryside, punching deep into the German rear. It was the moment they had planned for, bled for. But a war of liberation cannot be won on courage alone. It is won with gasoline. The breakout had become a kind of logistical paradox. The faster the armies advanced, the longer and more fragile their supply lines became. The ports at Cherbourg and the beaches of Normandy were choked with material, but it was piling up, unable to get to the front where it was desperately needed. The French railway system, a primary target for Allied bombers for months, was a twisted wreck, useless for the task. The advance, the great hope of the campaign, was in danger of sputtering to a halt, not from a German counterattack, but from empty fuel tanks. The city-sized army was about to starve in the midst of plenty. The solution was as simple in its concept as it was monumental in its execution. If the trains could not run, then the roads would have to become the railway. A plan was hastily drawn up for a massive, non-stop, one-way trucking route, a circular conveyor belt stretching from the beaches to the front lines and back again. To keep civilian traffic off the roads and ensure military vehicles knew the route, the roads were marked with a simple, unmistakable symbol, a solid red circle. They called it the Red Ball Express. For 82 days, from late August to mid-November, the Red Ball never stopped. It was a river of steel and gasoline, flowing 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. At its peak, nearly 6,000 trucks were on the road at any given moment, hauling everything a modern army needs to live and fight. The drivers were overwhelmingly African-American soldiers from segregated quartermaster and transportation corps units. Men who were denied a frontline combat role by the prejudices of their own army were now handed the most critical task of the campaign. They drove through the night, often without headlights to avoid German aircraft. They drove until they fell asleep at the wheel, their co-drivers shaking them awake. They were shelled, strafed, and sniped at. They fixed their own flats, repaired their own engines, and pushed on, fueled by coffee, cigarettes, and the grim understanding that if they stopped, the whole war stopped with them. They were the circulatory system of the invasion, pumping the lifeblood of ammunition, food, and above all, millions of gallons of gasoline to the thirsty tanks of the Third Army. The Red Ball Express was the ultimate expression of the American logistical machine, a brute force solution, relentless and overwhelming, that turned the tide of the war in Europe. The city was on the move, but a city built for war is a temporary thing. Its purpose is to be consumed, to spend itself in a final climactic act. And once the war moved on, past the Rhine and into Germany itself, the vast infrastructure that had sustained the invasion of France began to fade. The great logistical organism, having served its purpose, simply dissolved back into the landscape from which it had sprung. Today, if you walk the beaches of Normandy, the evidence is all but gone. The tide erases the footprints on the sand, but it cannot move the ghosts of concrete and steel. Out on the water off Arromanches, the colossal remains of the Mulberry Harbour still break the surface. These giant concrete caissons, towed across the channel and sunk to create an instant artificial port, are the most enduring monuments to the invasion. They sit in the waves, barnacled and broken, like the bones of some long-extinct leviathan. They are memorials not to a battle, but to a problem solved, a testament to the idea that if a port did not exist, one could simply be built and brought along. Further inland, the scars are fainter, more subtle. For months, the fields and pastures of Normandy were home to thousands of men and millions of tons of supplies. Great depots of ammunition boxes and fuel drums were stacked high in apple orchards. The land was crisscrossed with temporary roads, their surfaces made of steel matting. Hundreds of makeshift airstrips were scraped out of the farmland, accommodating the fighters and transport planes that controlled the skies. After the war, the French farmers returned. They filled the foxholes, ploughed under the tank tracks, and planted their crops once more. But the land remembers. From the air, on a clear day, you can still see the faint outlines of the airfields, their geometry imprinted on the earth as lighter shades of green in the growing crops. You can find sections of that steel road matting used as a gate on a farm, or a piece of a Bailey bridge shoring up a barn. The detritus of the city of soldiers has been absorbed, repurposed, woven into the fabric of a landscape at peace. The story of how America moved its army across the ocean is not, in the end, a story of generals and battle plans. It is a story of clerks, of welders, of truck drivers and naval architects. It is a story of numbers so vast they become abstract. 1 million men, 16 million tons of cargo, 200,000 vehicles. It was the creation of a mobile industrial society dedicated to a single violent purpose, and it was perhaps the greatest feat of organization the world has ever seen. It was a city of ghosts, a metropolis of memory whose only true exports were victory and death. And what remains is the silence of the vast American cemeteries on the cliffs overlooking the beaches, where the sheer scale of the human cost is laid bare in rows of stark white crosses. Each cross marks a citizen of that temporary city who never left. They are the final permanent legacy of that immense undertaking. The city is gone, the ships have sailed home, the trucks have rusted away, but the world they changed remains. It was the story of how a nation learned to move not just an army, but the very idea of itself, its industrial power, its organizational genius, its sons, across a hostile ocean to reclaim a continent. And it all began not with a rifle, but with a shipping label. Not with a bang, but with a bill of lading.